available over on the Moodle page if you're wanting to look at it while we travel along. What we're going to go through for this morning, we're going to continue to the patriarchs. We talked through patriarchy last class. Well, last class we covered the flood in Babel, introduced patriarchy and Abraham. And when we talked about Abraham, we had talked about Abrahamic covenant and the role that Abraham plays within the narrative. What are the elements to Abrahamic covenant? It was three P's. And you may or may not see this on a quiz.
People, place, and presence.
There you go. Good. The promise of people in the form of descendants, the place, the land that God's going to show him, which ends up being the land of Canaan, and then presence, God being with them, and the people being God's people. And as you continued along last class, what we had talked about is how these covenants get translated from each individual patriarch, from Abraham, then to Isaac, and then to Jacob. And so we're going to talk about specifically with Isaac and Jacob and get into their stories a little bit more. And then segue with Joseph, because Joseph really does prepare us for what's going to be happening in Exodus. And so again, Abrahamic covenant is essentially three things. Again, people, place, and presence. And this will show up on a quiz here soon. It may show up on a question on the final. So just a heads up. And these promises, again, become foundational for the way Israel understands both God and themselves. That these promises become foundational. This covenant specifically becomes foundational for their understanding. Again, how God relates to his people in the title, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then again, the demonstration of how God is bringing Abraham and his descendants into his household and under his care. Into his household and under his care. Because again, we talked about last class with patriarchy, how the patriarch assumes the responsibility for those in the house, and Abraham and his descendants are now being invited under God's care. And so, speaking of Abraham's descendants, we have Isaac. Isaac! And so Rebecca, who is Isaac's wife, meets her at a well, which again brings up this woman at the well motif, which is picked up in other parts of Scripture, including Moses, and then again with Jesus. And Isaac and Rebecca have two children, Esau and Jacob, which we'll get to know one a little more than the other. And between Isaac's kids, you have the presence of sibling rivalry. Who else has beef with their siblings? Think back earlier in the story. Cain and Abel. Attaboy. Cain and Abel. And so again, we see this kind of repeated theme that gets passed along through the scriptures. Again, I don't think it necessarily has much to do with kind of a sin gene being passed along as much as it is just, again, the natural disorder of human relationships and now how it's affected even familial relationships. No worries, Elijah. You're good, man. So you have this kind of stealing of blessing and birthright between the two. And so again, the connections between Genesis 1 to 11, that covenant that gets repeated. You have rival sons, God's choosing of the younger son. Because you have Abel being favored over Cain. And then this kind of sister-wife motif, which you find when Isaac has to lie and call Rebecca his wife in order to keep both of them alive. And so a lot of the Isaac story functions as a hinge between Abraham and Jacob. And if you read through Genesis as a whole, you'll notice that Isaac's story doesn't take up a ton of room in Genesis. Again, because of the way that Isaac functions as this hinge to get from one important element, and not that Isaac isn't important, but more so that you have these two very main and essential characters with Abraham and Jacob, for whom there is much that is developed in the story. Not as much is developed, but there's at least with Isaac as an individual, Because in Genesis 22, there does prove to be a pivotal point in the story, which we'll talk about today. But especially what Isaac's story will assume is this presence of bless or blessing, that the word Barak is littered through 21 through 27. And that theme of blessing continues through Jacob's narrative. But keep in mind what God's promise is in Genesis 12, that I will bless you. And so that theme gets picked up in Isaac, with the intention that Isaac is at least in part the manifestation of this Barak, of this blessing. That Isaac functions as a manifestation of this blessing, that it's not, again, just for this futuristic 2,000, 3,000 years later kind of event, but rather in the presence of Isaac that Abraham is blessed. And again, he's got his baby boy. Yeah, he had Ishmael, but the child that God wanted to give to him was Isaac. Again, one born from this unnatural circumstance. And so some of these questions, we're going to jump into Genesis 22 right now as we look at Isaac's story. But some of the questions that I do want for us to think about, that some of you may have heard this passage described as the sacrifice of Isaac. Or even in some of your Bibles, it might say the sacrifice of Isaac. But I do want to at least raise and bring up to your attention that what is actually happening in this passage? That is Isaac actually being sacrificed here? Or is Isaac sacrificed? And so we'll talk about that. What word or words are repeated in the passage? And I'll make sure that I kind of emphasize some of the words that I'm wanting for us to hear. Because again, in Hebrew, that they have a way of sticking themselves out and making themselves obvious, but in English, we can miss it. And then what is the result of Abraham's action? How does God respond? And so in Genesis 22, that after these things, God tested Abraham. There's a point of discomfort. And he said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am. And literally in Hebrew, that here I am means look at me or behold me. So you could think Batman would say, look at me. He said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering, and he set out and went to the place in the distance that God had shown him. And on the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place far away. Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. So the 2 of them walked on together. Isaac said to his father Abraham, Father, and he said, here I am, my son. He said, the fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, God himself will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. And that will provide here in Hebrews, God will see to it. For a lamb or for a burnt offering, my son. For the lamb, for a burnt offering, my son. So God will see to it. That will provide is just kind of the phraseology of it is translated for us, because again, it doesn't make sense that God will see to it. What does that mean? It means, well, the idiom means will provide. So again, that's something to keep in mind as we continue think about these words that keep repeating themselves. So God will see to providing a lamb for a burnt offering. So the 2 of them walked on together. And when they came to the place that God had shown him, Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order. He bound his son Isaac and laid him up on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand, took the knife to kill his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. Sounds familiar? He said, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham looked up and saw a ram. Can't go past that too quick. He looked up and saw a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide, or the Lord will see to it. As it is said this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this and not withheld your son, your only son, I will indeed bless you. And I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of their enemies, and by your offspring shall all the nations of the earth gain blessing for themselves, because you have obeyed my voice. And so, again, to go back to some of these questions at this passage, which is referred to often as the sacrifice of Isaac, and now to open up to some discussion. So, feel free to jump on in whenever you like. That is Isaac actually sacrificed?
No.
No. What happens?
The angel stops Abraham before he sacrifices Isaac.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Exactly. But what is, I mean, but to those, but to their credit, what does Abraham actually do to Isaac?
He does go through the actual process with Isaac up until the point where the angel stops him.
Mm-hmm. He binds his son and puts him up on the altar. So we at least have that. It's more like the binding of Isaac. Again, a little bit of a misleading phrase either by your Bible or whoever may be discussing this, because again, it's more of Isaac being bound than he is being sacrificed. And it is important to know when we hear the phrase boy or young man, we're inclined to think like a middle-aged or like a middle school guy, or maybe a teenager, young teenager, 14, 15. But rather the phrase is, you may see in some of your Bibles as young lad. But what that means is that it's just a young unmarried guy. So he's not an unwilling participant in the story. And that's really important to identify here. And so again, Isaac, who allows himself to be bound, is an active participant within the story. That there's no sign of struggle within the story that Abraham has to like hog tie him and then throw him up on his pole and hope that God gets him off the hook. No, it seemed, yeah, that Isaac's not necessarily passivity more so than it is active participation as a cooperative partner in the story. And so again, that's an important part to remember. But what word or words are repeated in the passage? And I called attention to some of them. What word or words are repeated in this passage?
I noticed that he said, or that it says a handful of times when referring to Isaac. Like it says, your son, your only son. Like it
Yeah.
doesn't just say your son Isaac. He says your son, your only son, or I might say that one time your son, your only son, whom you love.
Yeah.
You know, like it puts an emphasis on that.
Good. Exactly. So we have an idea not only of part of the conflict that raises for Abraham, because again, that you have coming in conflict is this promise given to Abraham about him having descendants, and then you have this demand for a son, which again brings up the point of conflict between the two and should add a little more drama in the story. And there's a couple other elements here that I'm wanting for us to catch before we move on. And it's related to a specific verb that keeps coming up again and again and again.
Would it be here I am?
Well, that phrase does come up, and that's really, really important because of what the symbolism means is participation or responsiveness by Abraham, even in the midst of, again, what's happening here at the beginning of the story of God's response to Abraham, that Abraham's responsive. And so again, when Isaac calls out to Abraham, Abraham's responsive. Here I am, my son. When the angel calls out to Abraham, here I am, Abraham's responsive. So this responsiveness to those that would call on Abraham, that kind of, again, that willingness to respond back to who it is that's calling him, and more specifically how Abraham chooses to respond to Yahweh. There's a couple more things, and that's a really important part, but it's in cooperation with something else.
Is it God will provide?
There you go. That phrase, God will provide, and I need to. So you'll see here, and this again, it doesn't necessarily show itself up in English, but we need to, again, kind of step back a little bit from the text in order to see it. But what we have, oh, this thing keeps bobbing back and forth. There we go. That Abraham looked up and saw a ram. And then the Lord will provide. This phrase, again, I've made the point earlier that will provide. The phrasing in Hebrew is literally that God will see to it. That there's something going on here in the passage related to eyesight, of being able to see. And again, that comes up more specifically in Genesis 22 than anywhere else, where you have, again, on the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place far away. Okay, the knife, here I am, my son. God himself will provide. So the two of them walked on together. When they came to the place God had shown him, Abraham built an altar. He bound his son Isaac. Abraham reached his hand, the knife to kill his son, but the angel Lord called to him. Abraham looked up and saw a ram. So again, there's this repeated motif of Abraham seeing in the passage related to God providing, or likewise seeing to it that a sacrifice will be provided for Isaac. And again, just as how God saw to it that he will provide a sacrifice in terms for as a replacement for Isaac, so God will provide for Abraham and his offspring here. So again, these plays on words that we don't necessarily get in English, we get to discover and kind of unravel, to piece back together and understand what is happening in the passage, specifically about how God is demonstrating himself, not just as one who demands, but as one who provides. Again, in the context where Abraham is being tested, because after these things, God tested Abraham. And sometimes the way this passage is fleshed out is, well, God knew what he was going to do, but he wanted Abraham to know. Or God knew the whole time what he was going to do, which again, that pulls away from some of the honesty that the text is trying to grapple with about how faith or loyalty is tested in the context of relationship. And it's in that context that God demonstrates himself, again, not just as one who makes demands, but as one who provides. Again, this cooperative partner working alongside an obedient other partner, which again, after this is coming off the heels of Genesis 1 through 11, and we talked about it a lot, and you guys worked on it a lot. Coming off these repeated rebellions, you have this individual that's not even unwilling to not cooperate to the point of giving up their own son, which again, for us sounds barbaric, but it was not uncommon in the ancient world to offer a sacrifice to a deity, and specifically in the form of a child. Even though God never ever makes the demand. And in Jeremiah, he later on goes on to say that the thought never even enters his mind. And the one person that does offer up their child is the Father, God himself. And so again, that what we have is this God who provides in this context, and again, and how God will show himself faithful to what's happening, especially when we get to the Exodus, because it appears as though God has given up on the people, and especially after exile. And so, again, so I essentially answered that result of Abraham's action. My bad, everybody. But again, to flush this out of what's happening in Genesis 22, that it's not much of a sacrifice as much as it is a binding. And what in Hebrew that means is Akedah. And that's what the story is referred to, the Akedah of Isaac. The binding of Isaac. And so we have this tension between promise, child, and test of allegiance, which I had brought up before. That you have this promise, this covenantal promise of Isaac being this child, but yet at the same time coming into conflict with what's happening with this, again, this test of allegiance. One of the things I failed to mention is this, the word burnt offering comes up a lot. So what is being asked for, this olah in Hebrew, is partnered with the word to see. Again, there's this visual element to what is happening in the Abraham narrative. And I had brought up what we did with Yahweh will provide, which is literally to see. Yahweh will see. And so I had brought up at the beginning, it probably didn't get noticed very much, but that this testing or proving that starts off this entire episode, and that there are episodes in the Old Testament where testing, you'll think probably Israel's testing in the wilderness. If not, Jesus being tested in the wilderness. If not, James talking about when we undergo trials and testing, that this kind of proving of loyalty to Yahweh. That Walter Brueggemann has a quote that testing is unnecessary in religions of tolerance, because we're saying just kind of where anything goes and half-heartedness is okay and you can do whatever you want. But the testing times for Israel fit is seductively attractive to find an easier, less demanding alternative to God. And so what Brueggemann is trying to get there again is that when we talk about faith, I'm not just talking about, again, the cognitive beliefs that we hold to, though that is important, but that also is not all that we talk about when we talk about faith. Again, what I want us to start thinking of is, in terms of covenant, is to think of faith as allegiance, loyalty, devotion, trust, confidence, all these different kinds of words that form the kind of components that get teased out later on within the story. But again, testing doesn't make sense if what is being tested is what Abraham believes about God. It's a theology test. And so again, that in the context of covenant, that the place for testing, again, is to determine one's own loyalty. And so again, that the demand isn't necessarily for a child, but rather the proving of loyalty. Which again, given the context of Genesis 1 through 11, it makes sense why you have the story about somebody who's so devotedly loyal to Yahweh, rather than rebellious and uncooperative. Josh, you got a question?
No.
No? Okay, you're good. Just want to make sure. And so again, that there's a modern tension that we have, because we often get very uncomfortable with this thought, but in the New Testament, again, that there is some Isaac in his 20s or 30s. He was likely a young adult, so he could be anywhere in the two. It's not really for certain. That we're not necessarily fully comfortable with that, because we believe that God should know whether or not we're loyal and what's in our hearts. But again, to be able to get the opportunity to express that loyalty, that devotion, which again, one of the things that Jesus commends to us in the New Testament, that if we love him, we will keep his commandments. Again, the demonstration of obedience as a demonstration of loyalty. And Jesus, again, is the ultimate example and model of that allegiance, that faithfulness. All the way to the point where Paul says in Philippians 2 that to the point of death, even death on a cross. And so, yeah, I know it's not a New Testament class. This isn't Intro to Biblit. But to tie some of these things together to see a fuller picture of how these things happen and how they're tied together, I think it's important for us to see that it's not just something that is for the Old Testament, but is also something that is important for us to understand what's going on in the New as well, and even for us as disciples of Jesus. And this is difficult. This is difficult, especially in a world that is, again, demanding of our allegiances and our affections. And where the last thing you want to do is to, as much as wild as it might sound right now, is to not be busy. And again, coming from, I'm a Hispanic male, and every time I go to see my grandpa, and again, part of it is his context, but he just asked me, ¿Cómo estás? ¿Trabajando duro? And I was like, See, como no. And so again, that he asked me how I'm doing. He asked me if I'm working hard, and well, it's again not bad to work hard, but the thought that if I'm not working all the time, then I'm not being productive. And again, the seduction of what does it mean to get more and more busy, to produce more and more, is the attempt to pull away from, again, to make myself more something than I feel that I am. And that's just only one small piece of the puzzle. Everything from lust that pulls at us, from trauma that pulls at us, from insecurities that pull at us, from concerns about money and family that pull at us, that makes it difficult, very difficult. Not to mention, again, the issues that we ourselves have within ourselves that pull at our loyalty and get us to try to. And it's not, again, I'm not just talking about the 15, 20 minutes we might spend looking at something we ought not to, drinking something we ought not to, smoking something we ought not to, spending somebody with time we ought not to, but really, where are our hearts invested into, and where are our affections turned to? That what, at our gut, what is it that we love? What are we devoted to? What are we sold out to? And that we see not just with Abraham, but also with Jesus, this devotion and loyalty to God, that yes, it cost them something, but what they get back in return is more, it's infinitely more valuable than what is being offered by the individual. And so again, this isn't just an Old Testament deal. It's something that we still deal with now. Whether it be to politics, to conspiracy theories, to a specific church affiliation, we see it both on a global scale, national scale, and local scale, and individual scale. And so all these different layers, again, that are attempting to pull at our allegiance to Jesus specifically. And so I've been saying for like the past 6 months, there's nothing more lethal to faith than fear. And I don't necessarily mean being afraid of something, but active, fed fear. That we're more obsessed with our fears than we are with love for Jesus and love for our neighbors. And that's wildly dangerous. Wildly dangerous. And so, are there any thoughts before, again, I don't want to move past this too quickly, but are there any thoughts, questions? Well, I do want to make sure I give you guys your time to be able to share if you have any thoughts. And wild times right now. Wild times. What do you feel might be one of the bigger, I don't want to say threats, but deterrence from, and not to say that you don't already, but again, just to ask the question is what are those things that you feel does pull at, again, your trust, your confidence, your loyalty to Jesus?
Honestly, like when I don't feel protected from certain things.
Yeah. You have any specifics? Not to put you on blast, but just to.
Yes, I don't know. Some of them I like. I wouldn't want to. I
understand.
Disclose, but
Yeah.
just like, like when you ask God, like, hey, please, like when something's kind of like out of your control, like,
Yeah.
Please protect me from this thing, because I wouldn't see why you would want this to happen, and it doesn't make sense. God's in it,
Yeah.
And then whatever it is that you're praying about might happen, and then you're like, where were you at?
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, it's tough, Ben. Yeah, I know for a long time one of the things that ended up being a root to a lot of different things was and again nobody has to go this deep, but it was part of the abandonment issues that I had as a kid. And some of you guys know this. My dad took off when I was 8, and I thought that was the issue, but it ended up being when my mom, she worked a lot, sometimes 2 or 3 jobs at a time, and so we spent a lot of times, as a lot of kids do, with the grandparents. And it wasn't just that we lived with my grandparents, but that we were like 3 or 4 hours away. And my mom would come and she would come back and leave, come back and leave, come back and leave, a lot. So, all my issues with pornography, with my suicidal ideations, with drinking, that I had thought that it was related to trying to mask some pain that my dad did because that seemed more obvious. Again, there was some physical and emotional abuse there. But there was also, again, the abandonment when I was 3 years old, 4 years old, that trying to kind of medicate a lot of these things that, again, we have the devices that we have to try to cope with what's going on in life. And this isn't a plug for anybody to go to counseling, even though if you haven't, you should. That ended up saving my life. But that so often it's undealt with trauma that we have, that so often is a thing that keeps us not just in fear, but keeps us tied to devices and mechanisms that pull at and tear at often our allegiance to Jesus. And so, again, if you find yourself in that kind of place, I would encourage you to reach out. That again, my concern, especially the concern of the text, is encouraging us to be more faithful, loyal people, not just to any specific system, not to any specific prescription of the way Christianity ought to be lived, but a more faithful, loyal follower of Yahweh. Take it to the New Testament, follower of Jesus. And so again, so that's why I bring a lot of this stuff up, is that again, it goes back to loyalty or devotion or trust, confidence, however we want to word it. But I know loyalty kind of drives at the heart of the issue a little bit more and seems to be a little more demanding. And so as you continue to go on, it took a little longer than I was expecting, but we had talked about this already, how Yahweh is going to repeat the promise given to Abraham, to Isaac. And so Isaac, in part, becomes a recipient of this covenant that God makes with Abraham. So again, between land, descendants, and that relationship and presence. And so Jacob, sweet, sweet Jacob. You have the actions or interactions of offspring. Again, you have sibling issues again. The kind of conspiracy and attack on Joseph. You have envy. You have Dinah, I believe, who was sexually assaulted. And her brothers end up inflicting violence on the culprit. And again, the connection to Genesis 1 through 11, you have covenant being repeated again. You have rival sons. And again, that seed theme, that the promise of descendants or blessing through descendants. You have Jacob who wrestles with God, which again, it's part of a theomachy, which we already talked about, kind of war, struggle with God or the gods. The Jacob wrestling with God. Noah walking with God. That ziggurat and Babel, reflective that kind of up and down movement between the gods and humanity, parallels Jacob's ladder, where he sees the angels ascending and descending. And you also have the repetition of barrenness with Rachel. Again, that likewise happens in Isaac's story as well with Rebecca. But there is a little bit I want to go backtrack to. Specifically, because Jacob's origins, let me finish. Jacob's origins do cue us in so much on the direction Jacob and the life of his children go. Go ahead, Joshua.
Sorry, I wanted to make an observation with
Yes.
the wrestling with God.
Yeah.
God, of course, renamed Jacob Israel in that.
Uh-huh.
And of course, Israel's name means wrestled with God, and
Yeah.
that ends up becoming foreshadowing for their whole history in the Old Testament.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And we'll flesh out some more of that here in a few minutes, but that name change that happens to Jacob and also happens to Abraham, I do want us to keep in mind the two things. One of them, the change in the character themselves, going from heel catcher or to trickster, shyster, to being wrestling with God, and the other one being a change in destiny. A change in destiny, not so much that he wasn't the leader of the 12 tribes, but that rather, especially when we get there, you'll see what we talk about with destiny, specifically Jacob. And so Genesis 25, that Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren. And the Lord granted his prayer, and his wife Rebekah conceived. And so this is why, real quick, when we talk about Yahweh being creator, why I bring it up, we can't just think purely in terms of Genesis 1 and 2, but that rather Yahweh is creating life for individuals as well. Verse 22, the children struggled together within her, and she said, if it is to be this way, why do I live? So she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples born of you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other. The elder shall serve the younger. Okay. So we have from Jacob's start a very messy beginning. What you have Jacob being named as heel catcher. What is it? Supplant, trickster, shyster, finagler, joker. And this phrase that the older shall serve the younger. So already from the beginning, again, this kind of preference for the younger sibling. Sorry, all the older siblings, myself included. And this exchange of birthright, which happens over a bowl of lentil soup. Lentil soup is great. I know not everybody loves lentils. I do. I'm not sure lentil soup is worth an entire life's inheritance, but Esau thought so. So he ends up giving it up. We also have a tale of 2 parents here at the beginning, where Isaac has favoritism for Esau. And you see this phrase come up, my son, a lot with Esau and Isaac. And for Rebekah, who has favor with Jacob, and likewise, you'll see this phrase, my son, come up a lot. And again, if we move past this too quickly, then we miss it. But Rebekah plays a large part in the narrative, and we'll see this when we read in a minute. But again, her help for Isaac to accomplish the means of getting and obtaining the blessing that was supposed to be Esau's kind of seals the fate for Jacob to be the next patriarch, the next in line. Again, it was a firstborn that was meant to be the inheritor of whatever property that the father had, but instead it all goes to Jacob, not Esau. And so Genesis 27. Now Rebekah was listening to Isaac when Isaac spoke to his son Esau. So when Esau went to the field to hunt for game and bring it, Rebekah said to her son Jacob, I heard your father say to your brother Esau, mind you, it's not my son, your brother Esau, bring me game and prepare for me savory food to eat, that I may bless you before the Lord before I die. Now, therefore, my son, obey my word as I command you. Go to the flock and get me 2 choice kids, not children. It means 2 young goats, so that I may prepare from them savory food for your father, such as he likes. You shall take it to your father to eat, so that he may bless you before he dies. Again, when I say women factor prominently into the narrative, this is what I mean. Again, because of her intelligence to be able to understand how to bring about certain events And so starting at verse 18, that so when he went into his father and said, "My father," he said, "Here I am. Who are you, my son?" Jacob said to his father, "I am Esau, your firstborn. I have done as you told me. Now sit up and eat of my game so that you may bless me." But Isaac said to his son, "How is it that you have found it so quickly, my son?" He answered, "Because the Lord your God granted me success." Then Isaac said to Jacob, "Come near that I may feel you, my son, to know whether you are really my son Esau or not." So Jacob went out up to his father Isaac, who felt him and said, "The voice is Jacob's voice, but the hands are the hands of Esau." Then his father said to him, "Come near and kiss me, my son." So he came near and kissed him, and he smelled the smell of his garments and blessed him and said, "Ah, the smell of my son is like the smell of a field that the Lord has blessed. May God give you the dew of heaven and of the fatness of the earth and plenty of grain and wine. Let the people serve you and the nations bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may your mother's son bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be everyone who blesses you." And so what we have here again is this kind of trifold blessing that Isaac gives to Jacob. Not Esau, but to Jacob. Again, that dew or grain and wine. This allusion here is to earth, that the earth will be productive. And again, for an agrarian society that is largely migratory and depends on good earth, not just to produce vegetables and fruit and various foods, but also to be able to give lots and lots of fields, lots and lots of pastures for animals. This is desirable and good. That again, may God make the earth nice and healthy for all you guys to eat and for all y'all animals. So let the peoples bow down, serve you, nations bow down to you. Again, reference to military strength as Jacob is journeying in the land. That again, it's one thing to have land, it's another thing to be able to protect it and to live on it for many years. And so again, this attention given towards land is not arbitrary. But for a people who are without land and without power, this means everything. This means everything. And then promptly after this event, the family is roughly divided. You have Isaac, who is old and deceived, Esau, who weeps bitterly, attempting to get a blessing, Rebekah, who is left estranged, and Jacob, not to sound dramatic, but he will end up departing, running away, and we could say he goes into exile. But God works out his plan nonetheless. So you have Jacob, 4 moms, 12 tribes. 4 moms who give way to 12 children, more, including a girl. The 12 tribes of Israel receive their names from Jacob's 12 sons, and these sons are largely a product of rivalry between sisters. And you'll see here a graphic. And those of you that come from messy families, take heart, be encouraged. I myself am a product of a messy family as well. What you see here, Leah has lots of kids. In fact, God feels bad for her because she's loved less than Rachel, so causes her to have a lot of kids. And then Rachel prays and God opens her womb and she has children. And then again, that Leah gets jealous again. So she has her Jacob spend some time with her servant, Gad and Asher. And then Rachel gets jealous. So Rachel has Jacob spend time with her servant. And so again, this story is not trying to glorify polygamy, nor is it trying to advance a specific cause. More specifically about the utility of women in the ancient or modern world, neither of them. But again, the messy reality of this story and how, again, this sibling rivalry, which continues even throughout the rest of Genesis, that it's not just confined to 1 through 11. And again, those that are often taken advantage of because of the rivalry that exists between people. And we saw it with brothers a couple times, but now we see it with sisters. And again, this is not to advance polygamy as the rule, but rather the confines in which the story is attempting to navigate. And so again, but you'll see here amongst the children, these are the 12 tribes of Israel. And then after Joseph, you have it split into two between Manasseh and Ephraim, which fills in Joseph's spot. Because yeah, Levi won't have a place, but you'll see amongst here Reuben, Simeon, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Gad, Asher, the two, Ephraim, Manasseh, which we'll talk about later when they come on the scene, and then Benjamin, Dan, and Naphtali. But these are where the 12 tribes come from. Again, minus Ephraim and Manasseh, which we'll talk about later, because it's important to note that involved here, and this is a side note that I will make a bigger point about when we get there in Exodus, that included within Israel's patriarchs, or within Israel's lineage, will be two gentlemen from Africa, Ephraim and Manasseh. Because again, Joseph is married to an Egyptian woman. And so already here you have a mingling amongst the nations at the start. Was marriage to more than one woman allowed in the Old Testament so the earth could populate more? Today it's really popular. That's not necessary anymore. No, because you see, especially, it could be an assertion you have in Genesis 2 near the end. That's why a man will will leave his father and mother and cling to his wife, not wives. And so again, that the original intention is a man and a woman in singular unity between the two. And so again, yeah, that polygamy within the ancient world was fairly common for the purposes of having more children, because death and childbearing for women was tragically high, and also death of children as babies was tragically high as well. So in order to ensure that babies would survive, that you'd have multiple wives. And so I guess the good thing is that, like, they believed in marriage, so they at least married more. But at the same time, again, this is not to try to advocate for a specific position as much as it is just telling us, working within the confines, what happens in the story. And again, we see, what I want to speak up is, again, we see the effects of sibling rivalry as one part, then also the basis for what we start to see as the 12 tribes of Israel. That Israel's story is not perfectly concocted and perfected and cleaned up for us to understand, but rather is messy, 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 and yet God still chooses to work with it. So let me see. We have a few things here. So Jacob's renaming here. I'm not going to go through the whole story again. So he said to him, this is after wrestling, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. Then the man said, you shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed. Then Jacob asked him, please tell me your name. But he said, why is it that you ask my name? And then he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. Then the sun rose on him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. And then you have a little bit of midrash there, interpretation. And so you have Jacob being, again, renamed from this heel catcher, trickster, to one who wrestles with God. And that this special relationship which Jacob has with God in wrestling is one that will be shared by God's people. You have wrestled with Elohim, you have wrestled with God and prevailed. That this special relationship that will mark God's people, this special relationship that will mark God's people. And especially going down into Egypt, we will see this start again to be challenged. So again, to go back to these children, it's going to be important for us to remember And then these last few minutes, I do want to talk about the Joseph story. Not that it's unimportant, it's rather important. But what I do want us to recognize is the way that the Joseph story will function is to get us from Genesis down into Exodus. Joseph's story tells us, how did Israel get into Egypt? It starts out with a dream, boy with the dream, and it ends with the people down in Egypt. But throughout the story, what we find is that despite the animosity that Joseph experiences, his life is marked by a special kind of favor and provision, much like his dad. Whereas Jacob experiences open favor specifically by a parent, Joseph experiences a kind of hidden or more subtle favor by Yahweh. Again, how Joseph's life is preserved consistently despite the appearance of extreme suffering, especially being sold out by your brothers and almost killed, and then being sold into slavery, and then again being thrown in jail again for some lady trying to grab onto you. And again, Joseph doesn't receive any kind of divine appearance other than when he has his ability to interpret dreams. But as far as it goes with the kind of theophany, that Joseph just doesn't have that, but yet at the same time coming to attention where, and with the Jacob story, that he still has this kind of favor that's with him, even if it's not so obvious. And so God's plan still moves forward through Joseph despite human action. And though God was supposed to be working through these individuals, God has to work despite these individuals, specifically his brothers. His brothers who plot to kill him. And then Reuben ends up, I guess, mercifully selling him into slavery. And then by Potiphar's wife, who throws him in prison as a means to get him killed. And Joseph, the ultimate turnaround, who sold into slavery, becomes the means of preservation for Jacob and his family. That Joseph, who is sold into slavery, becomes the means of preservation for his family. And this is an important note that I do want to bring up, I guess after an already bit heavy class, that Joseph specifically and his family, as a side note, that Joseph isn't aware of God's plan only until the very end of the episode, or at least it's not voiced until the end, where Joseph makes it aware to his brothers that what you guys intended for evil, God intended for good. Having seen now that there was a famine that happened in the land, that should Joseph not have been sent down to Egypt, who knows if the family would have any other means to be able to sustain themselves. It's uncertain what would happen to this family, but Joseph sees in retrospect what God was doing despite what was happening around Joseph. So again, that Joseph being sold into slavery becomes the means of preservation. Doesn't justify the means. But again, the God's use of even such a terrible event, again, to demonstrate power that way, not just through coercive action. And so I would fair to say a lot of times it's the same for us. That we often don't understand what God is up to until sometimes the very end of things, and to look in retrospect. What I mean by retrospect is to look back. And so much of theology and our understanding of Jesus is done that way, is in retrospect. Both in examining the scriptures, examining our lives, examining our experiences, a lot of our understanding of God happens in retrospect, and that we do theology in retrospect, in looking back. That's what Israel does, and we'll talk about it when we get there. That's what Hagar does. Abraham does it. That we get the language to talk about God after reflecting on what God's done. And so again, with the 12 tribes, going down into Egypt. What you have is this blessing by Jacob before Jacob dies. And some of the words that Jacob says to his sons will become part of what the tribes are known for. So, Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might, the first of my strength, turbulent as the waters. Simeon and Levi are brothers, their swords are weapons of violence. And you notice a lot of violence comes up. Simeon and Levi are brothers, their swords are weapons of violence. Judah, you are a lion's cub. The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor will the ruler's staff from between his feet. Zebulun will live by the seashore and become a haven for ships, which Zebulun was near the sea. Issachar is a raw-boned donkey lying down among the sheep pens, and more of a protector. Dan will provide justice for his people, a snake by the roadside, a viper along the path. And Dan was in the north. Gad will be attacked by a band of raiders, but he will attack them at their heels and run them off. Asher's food will be rich. He will provide delicacies fit for a king. Naphtali is a doe set free that bears beautiful fawns, again, having really good livestock. Joseph is a fruitful vine. White archers attacked him, but his bow remained steady. And Benjamin, little Benny, is a ravenous wolf. So again, this isn't necessarily something to have memorized, but to understand that there's something from Jacob's speech that proceeds to describe what will mark this people as they start forming as tribes later on. But again, you start to see how kind of violence factors heavily in their narrative, in their story. And so, are there any questions? I know, again, we went a little bit over real quick, but any
Are
questions?
those
comments,
flags
concerns?
actual flags of the tribes, or did you just make them up?
No, they're online. Yeah, that looks more like medieval times. Little flags waving around with the turkey leg in your hand.
Why would God allow for Jacob to be blessed after his deception? It seems like Esau was pretty innocent, and then I know it's at some point in the Bible, I don't know what it actually means, but it says that like God hated Esau.
Yeah. So that's an idiomatic phrase, and what that means is that God had preference for Jacob, and we don't honestly, we don't really know. It's just consistent across the narrative. Well, God has this preference for the younger siblings. It happens with Cain and Abel. It happens with Ishmael and Isaac, and it comes up again with Esau and Jacob. So it repeats this pattern. Some would say it's because, again, of Jacob, even if with Jacob's deception, he's still loyal in some regards, that he's deceptive towards human beings, but not necessarily with God. And that the one person he can't pull a trick on is God. That he's super, super clever. He could pull one over on Esau. He could pull one over on Isaac. He could pull one over on Laban, but he can't get one over on God. And so,
Didn't Isaac say to Esau that he would break the yoke? That Esau would break the yoke of his brother Jacob off of himself. How does that manifest?
he ends up becoming his own nation. The Edomites are descendants from Esau, so they're separate from them. And I believe they're never taken over by them. Yeah. All right. Well, if you have any more questions, I'll be around for a few more minutes. If not, again, you guys have as much time as you guys need for your assignments to get them in. Don't worry too much about them. Make sure you take your quiz for Tuesday. And just real quick, I don't have any office hours this afternoon. I got to get to a recording for a thing. So if you guys need anything, just send me an email and I'll meet up with you when I can. I'll be available tomorrow afternoon. So yeah, so you guys have an awesome Thursday. Have a great weekend. If you guys need anything, just let me know. See you guys.
Bye. Have a good weekend.
Bye.